Hello everybody, time to do chapter 8, our chapter on memory. This is a companion chapter to the learning chapter because if we learn, the information has to go in our memory. If it's in our memory, it means we must have learned it. So it's a companion chapter to the other one. So with that, we're going to learn the major types of memory. We're hopefully going to learn some memory techniques that might help us to learn more effectively and recall it when we wish to. So let's jump into it. Let's continue our discussion of long-term memory, looking at both the primacy effect and the recency effect. The primacy effect, remembering the beginning items better than the middle. Recency, as the word recent might suggest, remembering the last items, the end items, better than the middle. So you'll notice a distinct tendency for the middle items to be forgotten. So when you study your notes, you might want to put an extra emphasis on the middle to avoid this problem. And in children, often the middle child feels neglected, and it's often truly the case. They often do not get the fair share of family resources, whether it's pictures in the photo album or new clothes and toys. So make sure, whether we're talking about content and notes or children, that you never forget the middle. Next, let's consider a type of long-term memory called the flashbulb memory. These are very vivid memories. They have strong content. You'll often be able to know where exactly you were when you learned of such an event. Some are cultural, some are personal. Given this description, what do you think we should put in the blank? Will it be episodic, semantic, or procedural? I'll give you a moment to think. So episodic, procedural, or semantic. Indeed, if you were saying episodic, you were correct. People roughly my age will have the 9/11 tragedy as a flashbulb memory. But a traditionally aged student would probably have no direct memory of this whatsoever. So think of people your age and consider what might be a flashbulb memory for your particular cohort, in other words, your particular generation. A traditional age student will often say Sandy Hook. Consider your parents or your grandparents, what might have been their flashbulb memory. They might well remember when Martin Luther King was shot and when John F. Kennedy was shot. If they're older, they might remember when World War I was declared, or maybe when the victory was announced, and apparently all the bells of the country rung at the same time, or at least one by one as each community learned of the good news. Next, for our discussion of long-term memory, we will consider the 3 stages. Now, hopefully these 3 terms sound very familiar because these are the terms we use in our definition of memory. We said memory is a system that encodes, stores, and retrieves information. Let's consider encoding, and let's consider how it might be done. To do this, I'm going to give you a list of 10 words similar to what we did before for short-term memory. Listen, and when you're done, write down as many as you can remember. The words are hyacinth, azalea, amaryllis, tulip, rose, daisy, marigold, gladiola, delphinium, and carnation. And you can go ahead and write. Now, before I read the list back to you, let me ask you some questions. Did you get both the word hyacinth and azalea? Many students do, more often than not. Why so? You might be saying to yourself there at the beginning, oh, what's our fancy term for at the beginning? Hopefully you thought primacy effect. Now let me ask if you got both the words delphinium and carnation. If you did, why do you think you remember both? You might say that they're the end of the list, and you're correct. What's the fancy term for the end items? Hopefully you remembered recency. Now let me give you an or. Did you jot down daffodil or pansy or petunia or geranium or aster or dahlia? Very commonly I'll have a student record one or two. And as you might suspect, no, none of these were on the list. If you thought you recognized them, that reflects the nature of encoding. The human brain does have its limitations, so much of the time we record the gist of the information, and the gist of this list was all one thing: flowers. Now let's consider the next item that can be effortful or automatic in this encoding process. Automatic is just it happens on its own. Most students assume that encoding will happen on its own and you'll just learn the information, maybe by just reading your lecture a time or two. Effortful is much more accurate, much more useful. For effortful, maybe you might do flashcards. Maybe you might take advantage of the bonus PowerPoints. Effortful is much more effective than just relying on automatic. There's also three types of storage for this encoding: semantic, in other words, by meaning; acoustic, by the sound, or visual. So sometimes you might say, I don't remember the word, but it means this. You record it by semantic. You might say, I can't remember the name of the word, but I know it begins with a certain letter, reflecting acoustic storage. Or you might just record by the way things look. Now let's consider the second step of forming a long-term memory, that of storage. If we were computers, it would involve making changes on our hard drive. But since we're living beings, this storage must involve changes in the tissue of our brain. Try to remember what brain structure we noted in Chapter 3 helps us to form memories. It had a great mnemonic, if that's a hint. If you're still drawing a blank, perhaps the picture at the bottom right will give you an idea. Indeed, it was the hippocampus. Neurotransmitter, that did have a mnemonic also, but not as good as our hippocampus. Did the mnemonic go for acetylcholine or dopamine? Hopefully you said acetylcholine. We said A is for Alzheimer's, A is for acetylcholine. People with Alzheimer's are deficient in acetylcholine in their brain, and typically their hippocampus is very damaged. Brain changes, we know of many brain changes that lead to formation of memories. As we form memories, the branching structure of our neuron changes, the dendrites. Also, the membrane of our neuron changes, and even the shape of the little spaces between the cells, the synapses, they also change shape. Now let's consider the species used. Try to imagine what species it would be. It'd be the same for all other psychological research as well. If you said rodents, too bad, you're actually wrong. It'd be humans. Rodents are a distant second. But if we do consider the animals, rodents would be the most commonly used. Other species might surprise you. That would include the squid, because they have giant neurons and giant axon, and bigger makes easier. And also something called the aplysia, which is shown on the next slide. Let's consider an experiment that brings together both learning in the form of classical conditioning and memory. And this is the most interesting / bizarre experiment that's ever crossed my path. In this experiment, some sea slugs were classically conditioned. Others left it alone. Think back, what were the two terms for groups that we might apply right here to our two groups of sea slugs? I'll pause for a moment. Hopefully you were tempted to say the classically conditioned group were the experimental group, and that would mean the not classically conditioned ones would be the control group. Both groups of sea slugs were then sacrificed, in other words, euthanized, and fed to another group of sea slugs waiting in the wings. Some got the classically conditioned meal, others got the control group meal. Now I'd like to ask you to come up with a hypothesis, one that might be test-worthy even. Bizarre is actually better in this example. So go ahead and think of your hypothesis. I'll give you a few seconds. The researchers hypothesized that the sea slugs that were fed the classically conditioned sea slugs would learn more quickly than those fed the control group, and indeed that was exactly what they found. Human applications, not a one. Let's not go there. So we've discussed encoding, we've discussed storage, but now let's consider the third and last stage of long-term memory formation, that of retrieval. In order to be able to remember information, we first must have to have encoded and stored it successfully. But to retrieve it, we must then find the neurons involved in that particular memory, stimulate them so they have action potentials, and in that way, that information will be brought from long-term memory into short-term memory. Let's consider retrieval cues. Now, certainly, as we noted, being able to remember information depends on how successfully we encoded and stored the information. But retrieval typically uses retrieval cues. I'd like to compare them to road signs. In the pre-GPS and cell phone days, people relied more heavily on road signs to get to places for the first time. Similarly, in terms of long-term memory, retrieval cues are rather like those road signs. They help us to identify the information, find what we're looking for. There are various types of retrieval, and as a student, you should tailor your studying to the type of retrieval your teacher might ask you to demonstrate in class. Just the overall picture. Recall is of two types, recall with cues and recall without cues. For example, if asked to name a particular famous person, if you're just given a question with no hints, well, that's recall without cues. If you're given a hint, you are now doing recall with cues. Often when students get stumped, they might ask, what is the first letter of the name? Or the teacher might just provide them with a couple of the terms associated with that famous person. So recall with cues versus recall without cues. Also, recognition. The answer lies there. All the student has to do is to identify it. Let's see if this is clear or not. For the test listed on the bottom of the page, decide if it's an example of just recall with cues, recall without cues, or recognition. When you've decided, click the answer. For an essay, for example, such as a historical essay, name the 5 causes of a particular historical event. The teacher is providing no hints, no cues. You have to provide the information totally on your own. That would be an example of recall without cues. So the essay, definitely recall without cues. Matching the term and the definition, if they're both provided, you might be tempted to say recall with cues, but no, that's beyond a cue. That's the actual answer. So that would be recognition. Multiple choice, you've got the question, you've got the answer. So again, it's beyond cue. It's actually, again, recognition. What was the point of the pictures? For example, you see the picture of the ecclesia. Well, that would be a just sort of question.